From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to another edition of our little discussion about Chicago right here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. What a week, huh? Well, we've had a full-scale eruption of the hate and racism volcano that we all know just kind of rumbles along beneath our feet every day. Klansmen, Nazis, and the so-called alt-right plotting around in an American city with enough loaded weaponry to actually intimidate the police. And my favorite, the kind of khaki pants and tiki torch wannabes trying out their new racist slogans. That was so fun to watch. And a president who called them all nice people, many of them anyway. So it was kind of a tough week. But we will let the national media and the online world battle that one out, because here at Chicago Newsroom, we're also freaked out by the fact that our state is about to miss its second payment to its elementary and high schools. And that a plan a couple of years in the making that would have begun dealing with those decades-old disparities in how our backward state funds its schools, that plan now looks like it might be killed before it's born. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And if you're really tired about hearing about the problems of the Chicago Public Schools, I think you're going to find this conversation worthwhile anyway. So I'd like to have you stick around for a few minutes and give us a chance, okay? Because our guest today knows a lot about what's facing CPS right now. And he's written some very insightful stuff about just how dire the finances are, how entrenched the academic challenges are, and all those things. And that person, of course, is Juan Perez Jr. from the Chicago Tribune. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. It's been a while since you've been on, and I know you're a very busy guy trying to cover this mess. Let's be contrarian and start with a few little dibble-dabbles of good news. The Chicago Public Schools have some pretty darn good high schools, apparently.
They do. There's about, and as the mayor's administration is always very fond of promoting the academic gains that are happening within the system. The mayor, Forrest Claypool, this Chief Education Officer Janice Jackson. Any opportunity that there is to promote academic gains with the system, you see them doing that. And it's certainly helpful for them to kind of promote the school system as something worth investing in. I think that's almost a direct quote that officials have used recently, given all the rancor and uncertainty that's happening in Springfield.
Well, they can't have press conferences to talk about how wonderfully balanced their budget is, so they have...
It is technically balanced, at least on day one for now.
Yeah.
I think we'll get to that a little bit. But you did notice this week that there was a lot of talk about, especially on the NWEA MAP standardized exam, that for elementary students you saw a couple percentage point improvements as far as how our students were performing compared to the average across the rest of the nation. And yeah, there was some modest improvement there compared to last year. We didn't get to see kind of a school by school breakdown of how that performance was, say, separated out by ethnic group or things like that. But overall, it was enough for the city to come out there and say, hey, listen, again, this is a school system that's worth investing in.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so striking about Chicago Public Schools is the contrast, because we have what I'm sure must be among the worst schools, performing schools in the nation, and we have some of the absolute top performing schools in the nation.
It's amazing to see just kind of the broad range, only separated by a few miles here. Sometimes not even that much. And it's just, it's a question of how good the facilities are, how good the course offerings are, how good the academic outcomes are. It still astonishes me sometimes just to see just how broad those gaps can be in certain cases.
It's something that I've been kind of yelling about for a long time, when people just want to dismiss the whole thing and just say, Chicago Public Schools suck. It's just like the worst schools. Well, no, it's a complicated picture.
That's right.
And there are some just phenomenal teachers doing really wonderful stuff in really great schools with really committed students. And then there's the others.
And there's also teachers who and administrators, and I should credit also central office folks who are doing a lot of work in the struggling areas as well.
Of course, I didn't mean to imply they weren't.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, we talk about intractable problems all the time, and I'm sure we'll get back to that a little bit later in this program. But it's just it's a large battleship to steer, and it's difficult to be in a position where you've got to make improvements now, and you've got to salvage the system as it stands now, but you also got to plan for the future, and you also have to work towards improvement as well. That's a difficult balance to strike.
And I would argue that we have a pretty lousy partner in the state of Illinois, a pretty weak partner. I mean, it's been decades and decades and decades of essentially disinvestment from the state, and a constitution passed in whatever it was, 1970, right? That says, you know, that the majority of funding should be picked up by the state of Illinois, and we're down around a quarter. So there are historic issues that have nothing to do with the kids who walk through those front doors. And they've just been with us longer than most of us have been alive.
Yeah, you're right. I'd like to express confidence that a solution at the state level may be within reach here sooner rather than later. And I suppose I say that only because the effects of a protracted impasse would be so universal, I mean, and just felt so broadly across the state that you would think they don't even have a choice to really make this happen. But we live in Illinois. It's almost as if we should change the state's motto to "the buck stops here," literally.
Right. You know? I know. For a minute there, I thought you weren't going to say that, and I was thinking, Juan, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? This is the crux of what we're talking about here today, because it's Springfield. I guess we should just bring people up to date and give a little bit of brief history here. Let's talk about this legislation that you were alluding to that attempts to fix a lot of the endemic problems. Give us a background on that.
Okay, it's complicated.
I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
But I mean, essentially the idea is that, well, first of all, we're going to hold all the school districts across the state harmless in the sense that, you know, whatever aid they received before, they're going to receive again, and they'll continue to receive it. And we'll essentially try to create a system that evaluates each local community's capacity, their individual ability to fund their school system, and run that through a formula that determines, you know, what their local capacity is, what their gap to reaching an adequacy target is, and that adequacy target is kind of based on what best practices and evidence would suggest are the things that you need to be investing in a school system, right? Just across the board, whether it's, you know, teachers, you know, the kinds of resources that you need within a system. There's a whole list, I think more than a couple of dozen of different little parameters that all kind of go into this formula. And essentially the intended outcome is that, okay, the state is going to you're going to have a little gap towards adequacy based on your local capacity, right? And the state's going to come in and it's going to try to fill that gap with new resources. That's basically the idea. I hope I got at least the outlines of it right. But the interesting political tactic that was embedded in all of this is that this evidence-based model, when the legislature reached a budget deal not too long ago, it seems like forever ago, but not too long ago, that education funding couldn't be distributed under this new budget deal unless this new evidence-based model or a new evidence-based model was in place. And so that brings us to the position that we're in today. Yes, we have a budget deal. No, we can't distribute education dollars until we have this latest mess sorted out. And now you're seeing how, again, the partisan divides that are happening in Springfield are playing out and driving this, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we see this extend all the way through the Labor Day weekend. Me personally, that wouldn't shock me at all.
Yeah. So the main impetus for this is an attempt, I would say a sincere attempt, to try to equalize schools that, well, like we said, it's so complicated. Every time you start to say something, you have to go back another paragraph.
You're on the right track, though.
We rely far too much in Illinois on property taxes to fund our schools. And that's, again, a historic problem that they're trying to fix now. But you have this situation where wealthy suburbs, for example, where there's lots and lots of money, have really excellent schools because you know they've got the money to put into them. And suburbs that have almost nobody in them but poor people, or big cities like Chicago and Rockford, there isn't enough tax money. Well, some would say there is, but there isn't enough tax money to really bring these schools up to the level they need. And so there needs to be some way of reorganizing this so that every school gets access to at least something equitable.
A shot at equity, yeah.
And it looks like after decades and decades of talking about this, some folks in the legislature really came up with a plan.
There's no doubt that this is a pretty landmark overhaul of how education funding in the state works. And I think it's something that people have been waiting for, like you said, for years and years. But especially in the past 2 budget cycles, there's been more a sense of more and more momentum that we've, observers say we've never been closer than we are now to actually obtaining this. But then politics get in the way of a lot of things, and there are a lot of arguments on both sides, and one of the ideas that struck me was during a hearing on the governor's amendatory veto just recently here in Chicago, where you had Republican Representative Jeannie Ives say that, listen, this formula is one of the, I'm paraphrasing here, but she essentially described it as, this is the biggest piece of central planning that we've ever seen. This is a failed model. If you're confused about the formula, that's because it's confusing by intention, she said. And she said, if you're a superintendent, if you want your superintendents to be directed by the state government about how they should spend their money, then this model is what you would want. But she said, if you think you're smart enough to do it yourself, then you should reject this model. To me, that kind of gets at the heart of some of the underlying political tension that comes behind this idea, right? Why should the state dictate how we spend our money and how it's directed and so forth when we are perfectly capable of doing it ourselves? That's definitely, I think, an undercurrent that's been part of this argument.
Of course, the people who've been perfectly capable of doing it themselves would tend to be the people who live in areas where there is wealth and they have the resources to do it. And you could argue that people who live in places where there's dire poverty could also figure out ways to do it themselves if they just had access to resources as their colleagues do. So henceforth, there's this idea to try to equalize this in some way. But yeah, it's always tough. It's always tricky when you try to figure out a way to bring those amongst us with less than they should have up to some standard of parity. It's always a difficult fight.
And the question to me is, well, it's kind of the age-old question in political and budget reporting is, how are you going to pay for it?
Right.
Where's the money going to come from?
Right.
And in the future, there are some big questions about where the amount of money is going to come from that's going to be required to actually fund this thing. When Representative Ives says that this is that this idea represents a failed model, you would have some pushback from, for example, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, who was testifying at that hearing, saying that it's because the reason you could argue this is a failed model is because other states haven't fully committed to it in the way that they should. And that's the question here. Again, this is Illinois. And in the future, should this thing pass, if it passes in whatever form it takes, because I really don't know how it's going to shake out, where is the money going to come from to ensure that it's adequately funded from the outset to make sure that these resources actually exist to be distributed and we don't just have an idea of proration, which has been a big problem with the current or the past funding
very
formula.
Good point. Of course, what it comes down to for me is that you can call me a communist or a collectivist if you want, but when it comes to this one issue of providing an adequate or perhaps more than adequate education for each and every one of the kids who live in our state, it seems to me that we have to do everything we possibly can to have to decide on a floor of some sort, which is acceptable for every single kid in our state, and then build to that floor. If you want to go beyond it, that's great, fine. If you live in a wealthy community and you can go beyond that, that's great. But to have a situation where there is no floor, so there are people who are living in the basement, it makes no sense to me. I just have to say that I don't feel that way about everything. I don't feel that that everyone should have the same car, or something or whatever. But in the case of education, if we can't get it right on education, then what kind of human beings are we?
It's clear that, I've said this frequently, and I think there's no doubt that a lot of people believe that education is one of the defining civil rights issues of our time, especially of this modern era. And in a state like Illinois, there's just the stakes, like I alluded to earlier, the stakes are just too high. You've got to get it right.
It defines our collective morality. It really does, in such a way. But again, in keeping with I don't know where this is coming from today, but this effort to try to be a little bit positive because I'm just so fed up with all of everything else that's going on in the world. Kudos to the state legislature for working this out. This is something that they you know, we like to make fun of them as this do-nothing legislature, but they seem to have done some very heavy lifting here. It hasn't passed, but
that's right.
But I mean, you know, they came up with something.
And you know, again, my uneducated take on it is that compromise is possible here. That this just can't stretch out indefinitely. It's just the stakes are too high here. Yeah. To me, though, it's a question of who's going to get what. What are going to be the sticking points here? Is it possible that an entirely new piece of legislation is going to be required here to get this pushed through? I think that's entirely possible.
You do.
You know, I don't know if, you know, there's also been the idea that like some kind of trailer bill model, you know, you pass this version, you override the veto, and then you get some trailer bills through to sort of come to an agreement to get what everybody else wants. I don't know what the exact parameters of that would look like, but, you know, I think there is some speculation and suspicion out there that there may need to be just a new, somebody on the internet the other day described it as SB the other one. You know,
SB not
Senate
one.
bill the other one.
Right.
You know, and maybe perhaps something like that would have to be the vehicle to actually get this done. Possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also need to just make mention of the fact that this legislation passed the House and the Senate and then was vetoed by the governor. And again, it's, you know, without playing the blame game here, there's lots of reasons why on both sides, but the governor vetoed it. And the House has the Senate has a veto-proof majority, so they very easily overrode the governor, but it's in the House where the battle is, and they're looking for 3 or 4 or 5 votes in order to get an override, and it doesn't look, at this point anyway, I guess neither of us are Illinois legislature experts, but it doesn't look like they've got those votes, and that's why everything's kind of being held up right now. So, as you say, if they can't do it, then it's back to the drawing board. Everything just, poof, everything evaporates and you have to start over, right?
I don't know that everything evaporates. I mean, the House Speaker, I'm paraphrasing this week, but the House Speaker this week, I believe, said, you know, we're not backing off of this piece of legislation. We're not backing off of SB 1. My suspicion is, and the governor has also said that, you know, the parameters within the legislation are to the most part, you know, the 90% quote that he said gets thrown around a lot are to his liking. So I don't know that everything evaporates and you have to completely start from the drawing board. I think there's a framework there that people can get to yes on. Again, I'm not an expert on the individual, you know, on just the intrigue and the tiny little, you know, the environment and how it changes from what seems almost hour to hour. You know, but there are negotiations that are occurring, and I would suspect that something like this can serve as a framework moving forward.
Now, I was intrigued a week ago or so when, for the first time, we saw that a part of Governor Rauner's a mandatory veto, which we should say, by the way, was not just simply a no. It was far more than that. It was a rather extensive, expertly crafted take apart of the legislation. And one of the things that really got me interested was this idea that he's introducing vouchers, I mean, in a very serious way. Of course, they're not vouchers, they're education tax credits. But talk to me a little bit about, obviously, again, we don't have the expertise to know what's in the minds of individual legislators and whether they would accept it. But if they did accept it, if that was the compromise that had to be swallowed in order to get the rest of everything, what would that do to education in Illinois?
I try to think about it through the prism of what it would mean for the Chicago public school system.
Even better question.
And for me, it's difficult for me to imagine a scenario in which a model like that wouldn't lead to some kind of enrollment decline for the Chicago public school system. That's just me. It's just hard for me to see how that wouldn't be the case. However, there are some big questions kind of associated with that. And for starters, you know, one of the ideas is who's actually going to take advantage of this program? Should it pass, who's actually going to take advantage of this program? how much of that enrollment decline that we would see and that we've seen historically, how much of that would be actually attributable to this specific program, or how much of it would be part of, like I said, the broader enrollment decline that we've seen over the course of the past several years? Scientifically, how could you actually find the data to ask the question of, well, this person actually left the system because they, how much of it is actually attributable to the voucher program or the scholarship program, or how much of it is attributable to the fact that they were just about ready to leave anyway? How many low-income families would take advantage of this program should it pass? How would they have access to the idea? Really, the central question is how many people are actually going to leave. To me, it seems entirely likely that you are going to have a continued outflow of students and families from the school system on the aggregate. But to me, the question is, if this program would pass, how big of an impact would that actually have on that continued downward pressure? The school system likes to talk a lot about how birth rates are declining, for example, and just sort of these macro level issues are helping to, or I don't know if helping is the right word, but exerting downward pressure on the enrollment in the system. And so to me, what I still don't know is just how big of a factor would this voucher scholarship program be? How much is that actually going to contribute to the depopulation of the Chicago public schools? I don't know, but I suspect it would be a factor.
I mean, this gets into the very interesting and intriguing discussion of charter schools, because charters have been amongst us now for a long time, and there are many, many of them, and they're well established. And if you consider that the people who migrated into the charter schools left the traditional Chicago public schools, you would say that it contributed greatly to the decline in numbers at the Chicago public schools. But of course, technically, they're Chicago public schools.
They are still in the system.
And so they are still in the system,
Right.
and they count in the system. But I am just totally intrigued by the piece that you wrote just a few days ago about Noble network of charter schools, and how their faculty is attempting to organize. They want to be in the teachers union. We saw, what was the other, my mind just went blank, the other school system, the other charter system.
So you already have, Noble is making its efforts to organize, and should they successfully organize, they would join a broader coalition known as the Chicago Alliance of Charter Teachers and Staff, which is an umbrella organization that represents organized charter, individual charter networks throughout the system, and the teachers therein who are actually organized. And that umbrella organization is now deep into the process of actually joining the broader Chicago Teachers Union, and making that like a federated union here, which is a fascinating development, and I think one that's kind of been in the works for some time. You've seen material support and staff support coming from the Chicago Teachers Union to kind of assist charter teachers in their efforts, and it's just a relationship that's blossomed and is becoming formalized now.
Can you remember the other schools that are in it? The other charters that are in it? UNO schools are in it, right?
Yeah,
in the union?
Yeah, right. The what used to be known as the UNO network of charter schools just recently rebranded their names to Acero. Their network is part of it. The Aspira network of charters, they're also involved. And again, you'll remember over the course of the last year, after the Chicago Teachers Union eventually settled their contract, and around that time, charter teachers around the city, in these two networks specifically, started to agitate themselves and get organized themselves, and get and really push forward their own individual contract fights into the public. Well,
imagine being a charter school teacher and watching this and saying, I don't get this. The school across the street with the public schools, they're earning considerably more than I'm earning, and we're both doing the same job, so I need to organize. I need to get a piece of that.
Yeah.
But if they do, it undercuts one of the biggest reasons that charters were invented in the first place, which is you can make it cheaper by paying teachers less.
And it's really curious. I mean, there's just so many fascinating wrinkles in this, and that being a major one of them. Obviously Chicago has a very robust history of being an organized union town, right? You hear the chants on the streets, Chicago is a union town. They mean it, and in a lot of ways they're right. But that idea, that introducing that kind of wrinkle into how charters operate is fascinating to me. And not to mention the fact that like charter teachers also operate on a completely separate legal playing field than Chicago teachers do. They're not subject to the same pretty restrictive state laws that kind of dictate how collective bargaining with teachers in Chicago are supposed to work. It's almost like the Wild West in some ways, how one person put it to me once. Yeah. And so that just brings in, a whole host of other issues that charter teachers are able to bargain on that CPS teachers can't. And so eventually you could see this kind of confluence, I guess is the right word, where there's just so much overlap between, who's able to bargain over what, and how are rules changed to kind of reflect what the other side is or isn't able to do. Those sorts of issues are going to be really fascinating to watch here in the coming 5-10 years as this moves forward.
I've always kind of imagined that, I don't know when this happens, but at some point in the future, maybe a decade or more down the road, these charters are just going to melt back into the CPS system. It's all just going to become one thing again. Because once the teachers are all organized under the same umbrella, it just kind of doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. And the private companies that are making money off the schools will be making less off the money than they are. And I don't know, I just kind of see everybody saying, screw it, give them back to CPS. And then CPS will acquire some really nice buildings, and I don't know. I mean, it's very strange. But
it's interesting.
I want to really kind of talk about this gets us to the front door of this discussion about this mega piece that you dropped in the Tribune a couple of weeks ago about long-term debt, because we can have all these conversations, but the fact of the matter is, as we all know, CPS is just a giant steaming bowl of financial problems.
Wow. Okay.
And they just get worse and worse and worse. And I'm going to quote you back to yourself. One of my favorite things is quoting my guests back to them. By the time the $500 million loan that they just took out a little while ago, by the time that loan is paid off, children who are now entering kindergarten will be in their mid-30s, and the school district will have spent $850 million in interest costs alone on this one loan, making the total expense of that bond issue a whopping $1.35 billion. So when you see this structural deficit that CPS has, that's how it happened. It's just a series of these one-time crises that the only way out is just to borrow more money.
So I remember about a year ago, close to a year ago, I was sitting right here, you were sitting right there, and we were having a pretty sobering discussion about the financial status of Chicago public schools. And at that time, we were talking about a budget that relied on about $215 million from Springfield that ultimately never arrived.
The great 215 that never showed up yet.
And you made a point that has really stuck with me since then, seriously. And from what I recall, you said that in the late 1970s, early 80s, when you first started covering the Chicago public school system, from then until now, all that's really changed is that the numbers have just gotten bigger. But the underlying structural issues and the underlying problems that have been talked about haven't really changed that much. And today we're sitting here on August 17th, 2017.
A year later.
We have a budget, quote unquote, framework, one that may be subject to future revision, depending on what happens in Springfield, that assumes that $300 million in funding will arrive if legislatures manage to override and pass the current version of Senate Bill 1, the one that relies on a new twist of a city-sponsored infusion of $269 million, the sort of which hasn't been discussed publicly by anybody who's actually in charge of making these decisions. I mean, stop me if this is sounding like Groundhog's Day all over again. I mean, I guess I would put it this way. The district and the city are in a really unenviable position, like we were talking about before. They are in a spot where they're trying to manage today and manage for now in the face of seemingly intractable problems that continue to manifest themselves, right? But at the same time, and part of what we hoped that piece would point out about the debt, they still have to, I would argue, really think carefully about what kind of pressures they're putting on future generations as well, on the future school system, and on taxpayers of the future as well. Because again, these are not insignificant expenditures that we're talking about.
I could get you and jump into the time machine with me back to like 1984 or something, when the same conversation could be had with pension deferments. It's like, well, these pension deferments, they taste kind of nice right now because you're not worrying about them, but 20 years from now, this is going to be a real mess. But, you know, that's 20 years from now, right? And now it's 20 years later. And as you say, 20 years from now, oh, I can't even imagine. And it's all for, I mean, we don't even have like gleaming new schools to show for it. We just have budget crises averted.
For a moment.
For that moment.
For a moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, the pressure that's building, I mean, the pension expenditures from these deferred payments are extraordinary. I'm trying to think of what the number is here that, oh yeah, $773 million. You know, that's the contribution that's going to be made to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund this year, assuming it gets made. I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of money, and that ramp is climbing. But the debt service costs are also substantial, and they're noticeable, and they're going to be growing as well. And again, like you said, what the school district is getting for these massive, massive loans from their bankers are not the physical structures, the gleaming school buildings and facilities that you would normally expect to see. Instead, you're throwing a lot of interest and pushing off principal payments on a massive credit card bill, just to basically get you a little bit of cash now, so you can kind of ease a little bit of the pressure that you have on the checking account this year and maybe next year.
So if he were sitting over there, Governor Rauner would say, well, it's because the system's broke. The system's broken, and for years they've deferred all these payments, and now it's come due and it's their fault and they need to pay the piper or something like that. I would say that it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's a situation where this school system, which is charged with educating the largest number of low-income students, at least we know that objectively, low-income students, and therefore I think you could say more expensive to educate students in many ways. This school system has never been compensated for the fact that it is different from most other school systems in the state of Illinois. And I don't know, that's the way it seems to me. And so it's not just a case of just wanting to wildly spend money that they didn't have. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know.
Am I going off the reservation here?
I don't know. I mean, there's I don't know that you are, but I mean, there's so much passion and valid arguments to be made. Not to sound too much like the president here, but on all sides, you know.
It's funny you say. This is something that I say all the time. You know, it's like, oh, there's 2 sides to this. There's 8 sides to this. And now after this week, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say that. I mean, you got to pick a side.
We got to. There's a lot of nuance in this discussion, and funding a school system is unlike, and it's just like any other governmental function, right? We've talked about this before, about how the school system is just the last line of defense in so many ways, and is expected to kind of serve as this multifaceted agency that's required to do so many different things, and not the least of which do them for a segment of society that is desperately underserved. That is a huge...
And has been historically underserved.
Right, and you're going to be measured on how well you're serving them, right? Not just academically, but in all sorts of other facets, right? That's an extraordinary amount of pressure, and that does make public education unique compared to other units of government, I would argue.
Because just to interrupt, I would say, not that you would want to, but if you could remove or separate out these low-income students with all of these special problems of their own, you'd have a pretty darn good school system there in CPS. You'd have because what I'm talking about is the fact that this is all averages, right? I mean, when you average everything,
I see what you're saying.
And that's that's what the problem always has been. It needs special attention, but we don't seem to accept that as a society. It's like, well, that's their problem. If they can't get a good education for the same amount of money that everybody else is getting, then it's the problem with the parents or whatever it is.
I think part of the inherent tension here as well is how much should the city itself, how much of this burden, financial burden specifically, should the city itself shoulder compared to the state? That's the major piece of tension here, and there's a fascinating argument to be had within there, right?
Yes,
like how much should the city should the city be shouldering on its own? $269 million it's expected to come from somewhere, and I think you talk to analysts and folks out there who observe this sort of thing, and I think they would argue that there is some inherent risk in to the extent that the city ties its finances to those of the Chicago public school system. There is risk there. There's risk of contaminating the city's own books to a certain extent, right? And so you hear the city talking about like, well, whatever it is that we're going to do, we're not telling you what it is right now, but what we do end up doing will not sacrifice the city's long-term financial fiscal stability. The reason they say that is because they're aware of that problem as well. And,
of course,
but
they
also
get calls from the bankers every day saying, "What are you doing here?"
But there's then there's the argument. We haven't even gotten to TIFs yet, but that's a whole other discussion. That's fortunately, I think, starting to see a little bit more attention and starting to come out a little bit more into the limelight. And hopefully, there's some more. I think we can contribute to this as well as the Tribune and other news organizations in the city, just enhancing the conversation of just how the TIF system works in the city and where these arguments are coming from, and what merit do they have, if any.
Well, actually, I was thinking we should talk about that. I just want to let everybody know, if you happen to be listening on SoundCloud, our guest today is Juan Perez Jr. from the Chicago Tribune, and we're talking about Chicago Public Schools and the state of Illinois and the mess that we're all in, because we like to talk about depressing things here on Chicago Newsroom. It's what we do. It's what we do for a living. And this is Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. So yes, the last piece of this, I think, of this conversation is this whole conversation about TIFs, which, as Ben Joravsky always says, as soon as you start talking about that, people just leave the room. They don't want to hear about it. But yes, it's
I don't blame them.
Incredibly complicated, incredibly controversial.
Yes.
And it does play a major role in this conversation about how to fund the schools. Now, Governor Rauner has suddenly become like Tom Tresser and Joravsky and those guys. And, in the last 2 weeks, he's suddenly discovered TIFs, and that's become his big thing. It's like, well, the mayor has, he's got $6 billion that he's hiding in TIF money, and he should just put some of that in there. We're not going to give him money when they're sitting on all that money. I would argue that it's more nuanced and more complicated than that.
Absolutely, always is.
It always is. And one of the reasons for that is that we had Alex Holt on the show a couple of times. She was the budget director. And I actually got to have like a half-hour briefing with her beforehand. And, and I got only that much more confused, because the argument that the city makes is that, do you want to hear this? I don't know.
You got this. Yeah.
I got this.
Yeah.
The argument the city makes is that TIF funding does not depress the amount of money that goes to the schools, because the schools and the mosquito abatement district and everybody else, they have their boards and they have taxing authority.
Right.
And they say, this year we want $1.87 billion from Chicago's taxpayers, and they get it. They get every penny of it, because we all contribute some way or another into it. On top of that, the TIF, if you live in a TIF district, you have to put more money in, because the TIF takes some of it. But anyway, the point is that it's not because we have TIFs that the school district has less money.
I mean,
Do you buy that?
Well, for starters, well, there are many sides to that argument.
Yes, there are.
But I mean,
why can't anything be simple?
what The school district's ability to collect tax revenue is limited by the property tax extension limitation law,
Right.
which means that you can only, I mean, your property tax collections are essentially capped. They can move up a little bit based on inflation and some other factors, and you can also collect new money beyond the cap based on new property that comes onto the tax rolls. And so that increased value, you're able to pull in some of that money. I guess the question is whether, and I think part of the argument that the governor is trying to make, and perhaps even the Chicago Teachers Union, is whether properties that are currently kind of segregated into these TIF districts, whether those TIF districts should have been created in the first place, because the development that happened there would have happened anyway, and if it happened anyway and it wasn't in a TIF district, there would be new property value that could be, generate additional tax revenue for the Chicago Public Schools.
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting sort of, flip on that argument. But at the same time, again, the school district does get TIF surplus dollars from the city of Chicago in sort of very...
And TIF is used to build schools.
Absolutely.
And so, I don't know, I mean, Alex Holt gave us a number that I can't remember, but hundreds of millions of dollars over the last few years have gone into school projects using TIF money.
And it's also helped finance the costs of a teacher union contract as well last year, as we saw.
Yeah, it does that. But I guess my overarching point is that if you outlawed TIFs starting at noon today, not one dime is ever collected again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the schools or the libraries or the parks would get more money.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just... I don't know. I get very confused by it, and I know everybody else does. But the thing is that I think it's become this kind of football, or this something to kick around, to blame for the fact that we just simply don't fund our schools as well as we should, and that is a bigger, tougher something to sell to the public. I mean, you can't really go to the public and say, yeah, we know you don't really like the Chicago Public Schools very much, they're not doing very well, but we want to raise your taxes by 1/3 so that they'll get better. That's a non-starter.
Taxpayers have had to eat that already just in the past couple of years.
And for things that, like teacher pensions, for which they get no benefit, no tangible benefit right away.
Now also they've also had to eat a property tax increase that's directly intended to finance the construction of new school buildings and facilities. So there is some of that there. Yeah. And I think what the city is betting on is that to a certain extent the public understands the fact that yes, we do want to finance our public education system. We understand that this is a social good that needs to be financed, but everybody's got a breaking point, right? And I don't know how much patience there is amongst the city council or others to take on yet another tax hike. Why
is Rahm Emanuel stepping up and volunteering this $269 million? Why is he doing that?
Well, there's been considerable pressure on him from many sides to put some skin in the game, right? Show that the city is actually willing to intervene to a certain extent in the future of the school system. Again, though, there's a lot of questions as to how this is going to work. Is it a gift or a loan? It's probably a gift. I mean, it would almost have to be. But you do it once, and then there's pressure to do it again.
Then it's in the budget, right?
It's difficult.
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult for them to sell this as, well, this is just kind of a one-time intervention.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a struggle for them to do, even if that may be entirely what they would like to see this as. Yeah. But this allows him to say, listen, legislators, we're willing to step up, we're willing to do what we need to do. We have already, but we're doing it again. Now you guys got to close the loop here, and you got to figure this out.
Yeah. And I guess the mayor could make the argument that he has bitten the bullet many times in the last few years with huge tax increases that are desperately unpopular. So I don't know. I was going to ask you about layoffs, but we're running a little bit short on time. But I mean, they're now talking about laying off 240 elementary school teachers, 116 high school teachers, hundreds of other staff, but many of those will get rehired, right, as they recycle through the schools, through other attrition and all that.
Yeah,
Is it a big story?
I mean, this happens every year, which isn't meant, and that statement isn't meant to minimize the fact that this is actually what these layoffs reflect, are what we were talking about earlier, a reduction in the population in the Chicago public school system.
Yeah.
And once the official head count is taken after the school year starts, there could be additional cuts and layoffs that happen if projections aren't up to snuff, or if for some reason there's just more of an outflux than they expected, is how I should phrase it. So this is real. This happens every year. Yeah, some of these teachers do get their jobs back, but not all of them do. I think the district says that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% historically, is the argument that they make, are actually able to get rehired. And that's the district's number, and still that's not, that leaves a substantial amount of people who are actually out of a job once the dust settles on all of this. So yeah, I mean, it's almost become routine, when we cover this every year, that, when the budgets are set for individual schools and the staffing levels come out and there's this reduction, it's almost expected. And I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, I mean, we lived through a period a few years back when the school population was steadily rising all the time, and so this was not something we were familiar with. And now, with the school population dropping, and in fact dropping fairly significantly, this is something that we do have to, I guess we have to prepare for. But I don't know what the long-term demographic numbers are, whether there are going to be more kids coming into the system in the next 10 years or something, but it's what we're dealing with now. Juan, we're really kind of running out of time here. Summarize this for me. Give me a concise, intelligent statement about where we're at and whether I have any reason to be optimistic.
These are not.
Or whether
this
I
is
should
not
just
in my
go.
wheelhouse. Concise
Whether
and
I should just
intelligent.
go like join a militant union or some protest groups or something.
I mean, the Chicago public schools will be here tomorrow. They'll be here next year.
Yeah.
They'll be here the year after that. What is the district going to look like in 10 years? I don't know. We're really at a stage now where, again, people are going to have to come to some really difficult decisions about how the decisions they are making are affecting future generations, and how is that going to shape the school system that we have in the future, if we want to maintain, whatever academic gains that we've obtained, and if we want to, impose some sense of fiscal stability. That's a big problem that people are going to have to solve here. The decision makers are going to have to solve here. Is there room for hope? I mean, is there reason to hope? People will continue coming to work every day. Students will continue coming into school buildings wanting to learn. There will be parents who want their kids to strive and achieve and do better than they did, and stand on their shoulders and become citizens of the future who are productive and who are happy and healthy. Those factors aren't going to change. But the Republic, our country, is at a stage in its history right now where so many things are so uncertain, and that if one thing leads to another and goes down a certain path, things can look dramatically different than they did today or yesterday. And I guess that's where a lot of the concern lies for me personally, is I don't know what it's really going to look like. I don't know, I can't make a succinct case for why somebody who is coming to the city and really wanting to put their kids into the Chicago public school system, if they walk up to me and they tell me, why should I do this? Well, I can tell them why, but if they ask me, well, why should my kids stay here and put their kids into the Chicago public school system, 20 years from now, then I'm like, well, that's a much more difficult question in a lot of ways. So is that an answer? I don't know.
Well, I'm joking when I say give me an answer. Obviously, you can't, and you're not supposed to. You're a journalist, and that's the whole purpose. That's why we have journalists, is to journal, to keep an eye on things and report to us what's going on. And you do a particularly good job at that, and I'm really happy to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Bit of a Debbie Downer show today, right? But hey, that's, like I said, that's what we're here for, folks. We're here to help you get a little bit more depressed about the future of our lives. We'll be back next week with another show, I'm sure, that will be even more uplifting than this one. Thanks very much to Juan Perez, Jr. for being with us today from the Chicago Tribune. A really good discussion. I really enjoyed having it. And we'll be back next week. As I said, don't forget you can go to this address at any time to see any of our shows. Watch this one whenever you want online. And you can also listen to us on SoundCloud or iTunes. Go for a walk and go for a nice, beautiful walk on a sunny day. And then at the end of 40 minutes, you'll say, I ruined my whole walk.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, right. Just a public service of CAN TV. See you next week. Bye.